Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. It was a real honor to be able to share a little bit about what I've been doing globally from Kansas City for the past 15 years or so. And I thought I'd get started off by just giving a little background on how I got interested in international to begin with. Because I was born on a farm here in Kansas, just south of Kansas City, and had been, over 10 miles away from my house at various times growing up, but really hadn't done much traveling at all. And then when I was in high school, I went and joined a group called Amigos de las Americas. Some of you may be familiar with this. They take basically teenage kids and they plop them in rural Latin America. And you're supposed to be supportive of the community that you're in for some time. And I think we ended up being a little bit of a drag on the communities most of the time because we're just kind of people from the north coming down and eating their food and everything. So we tried to make ourselves useful. But while I was in Ecuador in 1999, they had an uprising, an indigenous uprising against an IMF mandate that came down from their failure to adhere to basic lending standards globally. They'd had some political turmoil. And while I was there, the entire country shut down. So there were strikes everywhere. We had to be evacuated out by a military plane. And through that process, my eyes were open to there's amazing stuff going all over around the world. And I wanted to become a part of that. So instead of going back to the University of Missouri to finish my studies, I decided to go move over to Spain for about 9 months. I studied for 9 months in Spain, but really got passionate about just traveling, interacting with different cultures. I wound up in North Africa for about 3 months, just kind of backpacking around, learning a little bit of the culture, immersing myself in what was going on there. Came back to the United States and set off on another about 6 month, 9 month trip down into South America, um, really just kind of hitching my way around the world. No real, I wasn't staying in hotels or hostels or anything, just kind of thumbing rides around. And I became passionate with this idea of communication based on friendship, trust, and being able to offer something in return for maybe a little lodging or a ride somewhere. So I just became passionate about cross-border exchanges. I became a Spanish teacher in the Kansas City, Missouri School District, and then Rockhurst High School, and then ultimately Hickman Mills High School, and enjoyed that, but thought there was something else for me to do globally to try to use some of the skill set I'd learned, not only from a language perspective, but also a trust building perspective. And Lockton Companies offered me what I consider to be a perfect opportunity to work on their global client service team. And for the past 13 years, that's all I did was help US based and Canadian based multinational companies to operate globally from a risk management perspective. And what did that look like? So that meant that I was supposed to go and visit global operations at their headquarters, get a real understanding for what they're trying to accomplish globally, learn what their objectives are, how they're planning to grow, where they might make their next acquisitions, what sort of product rollouts they had. For some large engineering and construction firms, they were often trying to bid and win large mega projects with sovereign buyers overseas. And so I would want to understand what their strategy was. And then I would fly over or drive north or wherever to go and meet the local operations and get a clear understanding of, okay, how does that fit in with, how does their local mandate, their local objectives, their local business, how does that fit into what the global parent was asking them to do? I wasn't really a mole so much as a translator, in that there are certain things that must be done in a local market to be successful. For instance, if you want to bid on football or soccer stadiums in Doha, Qatar for the World Cup, there are certain ways of doing business through a local sponsor that are required in order to even be able to bid a deal. The US parent might have very strict rules against how you bid jobs and how you perform work. So my job was to make sure that we had a clear understanding of the type of sponsor they might be using in Doha, Qatar, for example, make sure that that would clear any Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, make sure that they were not on any sort of sanctioned list, and then make sure that we had the proper insurance documentation in place locally so that they looked like a legitimate company operating as locally as possible. And then on the backside, making sure that the US parent company, for example, would have in place the proper global protocols to make sure that everything was in compliance. And then to also make sure that those global insurance programs were set up so that if something did go south or something ran afoul in the local market with the relationship, perhaps with the sponsor, perhaps there were letters of credit that were required in order to secure project funding, and or if something actually went wrong on a job site, that global company is protected as well. So it became a really interesting way for me to understand the nuances of doing business in about 125 different countries from a risk perspective, and trying to bring that back to the mother and say, here's what your locals need from you in order to be successful on the ground. So that was the part I got most passionate about, was learning what my clients were doing in given countries. And it became surprising how often there was a disconnect between the mother company and the locals as far as what they were even doing. Whether it's a food processor, whether it's a manufacturer, whether it's a professional service firm, the idea in the head of the mothership about what was going on in the local country at any time was not usually entirely accurate. And you could usually find out, or I can usually find out really quickly when I'm visiting folks. But at first it was shocking to me. I would travel all the way over to maybe like China, and not in Shanghai. I'd be 3 or 4 hours inland, and I'd be meeting with the local representatives, and I would not be permitted to walk the shop floor. I would not be permitted to do anything other than sit in a very windowless boardroom with the one person who spoke English, probably didn't even work for the company, to hear a story about what was going on there when I could tell they were reading from the corporate list. That would tell me that probably this would require a little more investigation, and I should tell the mother company that, great people, we met them, they're fantastic. I don't think I talked to any of your local employees, nor was I permitted to go anywhere on site. That was usually a good clue that there was something not nefarious going on, but something that was maybe out of step with the global program. So even that bit of information sometimes is useful to the US parent. In addition to learning about those clients locally, I also had the obligation to make sure I understood what local regulators were doing in a given jurisdiction. What I learned over time is that all things global are really just the ability to look local everywhere. Most countries, most regulators don't find global to be all that impressive, because if you bring a global platform into a local jurisdiction, the global piece isn't usually taxed in the local market. A global company may not be actually hiring in the local market. They're going to be bringing expats in. And a global company might not adhere to the local business practices. I kind of outlined a little bit maybe in the Doha example. They might not be supporting the local economy through, going through the channels that you're supposed to go through to get business. So a global company, oftentimes, even though they look megalithic and they look like they can have all of these abilities to perform anywhere in the world, they're usually only successful if they fully invest into a local community. They hire local employees. They join the local chambers of commerce. They sponsor local teams of some sort. They get involved in the community. And then they set up a local presence. When they do that, though, they need to make sure that it's very clear how they're setting up an organization so that they may take advantage of tax benefits, just like any organization does when they set up. So getting involved with some sort of chamber of commerce, the local, the consulate general in a given country, make sure that they're establishing relationships with local employment firms, payroll firms. Everything needs to be done from an accounting perspective. Everything needs to look local. And one of my jobs was to help companies decide if the risks they were taking locally were consistent with what a local firm might do. When you buy insurance, you're really agreeing to take a risk and transfer it to someone else in exchange for some money. So in India, for example, well, I want to tell a quick story about how this works. So When you buy insurance for your automobile, for example, you have a deductible in case you bump into something. You might be on the hook for the first $500 of your vehicle repairs, maybe $1,000. We're pretty comfortable in that space in the U.S. For large corporations, they might take deductibles of millions of dollars for things like damage to their factories or even injuries to employees. They might take it on their own books because it brings about some cost efficiencies. Why have somebody else pay that when I can just do it myself? So we spend a lot of time talking to firms where in India, you don't have a deductible. The insurance company pays for everything. They don't want anything out of their pocket. In Northern Europe, for example, than the UK, people are more comfortable with a deductible. Germans do not have deductibles. Across China, a lot of people, they just don't buy insurance. The concept's not as readily practiced as it is here. So they might not understand why they're even supposed to buy insurance at all. That's a mandate from above. So when I'm in a given territory, I might have to explain to the local parent or the local company why we're buying insurance at a certain level that makes absolutely no sense for them in their own mindset, and then work with the local insurance companies to maybe find a solution that fits what they're trying to do. But what I learned time and time again in every jurisdiction that I worked is it's not as if the mother company was seen as a dictator or was seen as trying to step on their toes. There was always this sense, though, that they don't understand what we're trying to do here. They don't understand what it means to be an engineering firm in Australia, or they don't understand what it means to process chicken in Malaysia. The parent company is coming down from a global perspective, and my job was always to find the right solution locally. Doing that, though, means that you have to stay on top of about 1 million different news sources, because you have to look somewhat intelligent before you show up in a country, right? I don't pass as North African, and if I'm in North Africa, even if I'm fluent in Spanish, I don't pass as Peruvian when I go there, right? So I would need to be somewhat knowledgeable about what's going on in the local jurisdiction just to have even the hope of a conversation without just looking like somebody sent from the US to come in and spy on them or tell them what to do. So I became passionate about news sources, and I'd be curious to open it up in just a second. I'll share some of my news sources, but I'd love to hear from some people on the call right now where you're going for news. I found The Economist to be tremendously helpful. They don't typically dip their toe too much into the political landscape, other than providing a high-level overview of what makes economic sense. And they usually have very deep dives on what's going on in I'm not going to say obscure parts of the world, but they might do articles on a certain political situation or a certain economic situation that's very bespoke to a region. So The Economist is a fantastic one for me. And then going online and looking at local newspapers a few days in advance of my trip, I always found was a fantastic thing. Just know what the weather's like in a country. And I still do that today, now that I'm not able to travel overseas as much. Is if I work with a lot of German parent companies, if I'm saying, hello and getting started with a video conference with them, I need to know what the weather's like that day, so we can talk a little bit about, what your kids are doing or what my kids are doing and how the weather affects them. It just adds that other element of I'm with you locally on some of the little mundane parts of our lives. I think that goes a long way. So I'd like to open it up. Does anybody on the call today have a specific news source they go to?
Well, I was going to say, when I've traveled, I have always looked at local sources as something, because especially as you said, with language and things like that too, if you know an ounce of it, to try and just familiarize yourself with it again, especially if you're rusty in a habit. I usually go local, but I would also say probably The Economist. As someone who's not in risk management and insurance and all of those things, it's definitely hard, I think, to find, a good quality source that, the layman can understand. But yeah, anyone else have any other?
No, that's fine. It looks like
It
somebody's,
looks like,
yeah.
yeah, it looks like Big says Financial Times. And someone actually has a question. What's your go-to news source for China?
So this was something I was going to talk about next. As far as a news source specific to China, I don't have one. I tend to go pretty local with my teams in country. I find that from the business perspective, I need to understand what's happening on the ground. And at Lockton, we're blessed to have operations in 32 countries that are fully owned by us. So there's about 5,000 of us in the US, and there's 2,500 of us outside of the US. And where we don't have an owned office, we have a partnership office. So I tend to make the rounds. About once a month, I'll end up talking to someone from, there's about 50 countries I stay close to from a business perspective. And I try to have at least one 30-minute chat with them on what the current insurance market conditions are looking like. But from just a high level news perspective, I stick with some basics. And really the Economist is where I go just for my overview of what's happening. Anything specific locally, I go to individuals. Yeah, it looks like somebody else is saying the Guardian for broad perspectives, and that's what I do. One thing I've found to be tremendously helpful in staying in touch with people in different countries is using the various apps that they use to communicate. So, I mean, most of us are probably emailers or texters. I know that there's some Snapchat stuff going on. I've found that using the local app to communicate adds a tremendous advantage. And, if I just pull up on my phone real quick, a couple of the apps that I use um, I was going to say WeChat. Somebody, Bing just said, WeChat's the only way I get a hold of folks in China. And that's really the best way to navigate any even business conversation. I found that the email at the end of the day is almost like the written letter. So if I need to formalize a business deal, the email is how I finalize it. Korea, for example, I use Kakao Talk. I find it to be a tremendous way of getting in touch with people. I find the Korean business community to be one in which they're not hyper responsive on emails because typically, again, the email is a more formal system. And at least on the insurance side of things, I've found that if I want to do any real negotiating, that's either a phone call, which can be challenging with 14 hours difference. But Kakao Talk is something that people are very comfortable with. And then in Germany, they use a system called Xing, Xing. I don't know if anybody's seen that. It's similar to their LinkedIn. Well, it's sort of a job sourcing communication style. Just like LinkedIn is really meant to find jobs, but at the end of the day, it's also a business development tool and just a way to network with people. Xing is similar to that. I find that it's not got 100% adoption, probably among like the baby boomers, but the Gen X and younger seem to be using it professionally. And then WhatsApp is just, that seems to be the standard across the Middle East. It seems to be very functional in Northern Europe. And then on through South America, I find that WhatsApp is the way to go. There's a couple of others. Taiwan and Japan typically use Line. I don't know if anybody's seen that one. But those are the ways that I've found the best way to just touch base with folks. Make sure you can prompt them for a call. One of the things that we were supposed to talk about was the education that's useful for this tool. And I would say on international stuff, and I'd be happy to hear what anybody else is sharing here. I find that experience is the absolute best teacher with international. Being able to have some sort of personal experience in a given country automatically lends a bit of credibility to any discussion or negotiation professionally. And it's not so much a competition to say, oh yeah, I've been there, I've seen those fancy restaurants, or I've been to the top of the tower, or done a great hike or something. I find that it's most meaningful when you can share something a little more, again, it's the mundane pieces of the trip that demonstrate you kind of have a good understanding for how life works there. So I think that maintaining friendships in countries is just an essential part of doing business successfully, is make sure there's more than just the transactional relationship. You know, life's not an administrative burden. Life should be something that we share a little special vulnerability with each other. It breaks down those barriers so that there can be a beginning of a trusted relationship. And in my industry, which is insurance focused, it's an entirely trust-based relationship, because I'm asking you to pay for something if I screw it up. So I need to make sure that you actually are going to pay for that if something happens. And if I'm not really a trustworthy individual, or if you feel like I've got some other agenda, probably we're not going to be able to do business very well. So sharing a little bit about myself, my own vulnerabilities, seems to be a great strategy in order to let people share a little bit more about themselves, because I need to understand what they're doing. And without getting, I think, too political here, sometimes people aren't as willing to share with the American when they walk in the room immediately. There's a little bit of a cost that comes into trust, and you have to leap that hurdle relatively quickly. As far as the skills and abilities that I've developed as a result of this work, I'd say the ability to work on no sleep is a pretty effective one. I don't typically travel first class ever. So, you know, being in the back of the Delta flight with the seat that doesn't recline, landing at 6:30 a.m. somewhere, and being at the 9 a.m. meeting after a shower at the airport, you know, you got to kind of be ready to roll. So I think trying to take rest where I can is important, but really just being efficient with how I am staying calm and comfortable so that I can be prepared to act at any time. And time zones are just a challenge that you learn to deal with. But that was one that took me a little bit of time. And my strategy for time zones, I'd be curious for anybody else's, as soon as I step foot on a plane, I behave as if I'm in the new time zone. So if it's 1 o'clock in the morning where I am, but it's 6 a.m. somewhere else where I'm going to land, I just begin acting as if it's 6 a.m. right then, in the hopes of getting myself somewhat acclimated. I know other people who just try to take an Ambien and crash as soon as they get on a flight. I've found that anything other than maybe one glass of wine on a flight doesn't serve me well when I land. So I'd like to open it up. Does anybody else have strategies they use for stepping off flights?
Hi. I'll add on that for a little bit. I fly in from Malaysia. I'm originally from Malaysia. So what I do usually, if I go back or if I come over here, I'll just no sleep straight on the flight, and so that I can, you know, come back and adjust it quicker and stuff like that. So that's my experience for most of the time.
Yeah, that's a good one. Everybody's got their own tool set. I saw someone that just sent a note over and asked, how do I get into a local language and culture? What tools do I use to assist? So I'm fluent in Spanish, and I can read a lot of different languages as long as they use Roman characters for the most part. But my youngest son is in a Chinese immersion program. He's in first grade. So I've been trying to pick it up with him, and I practice doing some of the basic phrases with him on a regular basis. He's only in his second year of it, so my Chinese is really poor. But anytime I like to exercise and run and stuff, I go through my exercise time is my language time. So I'll either be counting or going through phrases or thinking through the colors and numbers, whatever it is that I'm working on for that day. I use my exercise time as my language time for Chinese practice. And then some of the languages I just find to be almost intoxicating. Turkish, I think, is phenomenal. So, but as soon as I'm gone, I forget everything. So I always try to learn some very basic phrases and then pick up one sort of cutesy thing so that I can pull it out and surprise people with it. They never understand what I'm saying, but it at least creates a conversation topic around where did you get that? I find the apps on the phones to be tremendous. They require no investment and they give you the sound of what it's supposed to sound like. So I like that. Someone else sent something through about insurance regulations. Oh, there we go. Yeah, the Insurance Coverage Law Center and Business Insurance. Yeah, we have a subscription to a group called AXCO. I find AXCO to be extremely helpful on any insurance regulations globally. It's dense material, but it's useful to me. And typically there's some sort of legal and tax piece to it as well. So those are good news resources for insurance. A lot of times though, the insurance regulations in a given country are codified, so you can go and find them actually on a Google search to find out what the actual insurance law is. And similar to in the United States, they're usually relatively complex. So anytime someone's doing any research for insurance, tax, or legal opinions in a given country, I tend to steer clear of summary websites or summary documents. I always find it's best to look at the letter of the law and make sure that you're towing the line on exactly what the law is in country. Some other things that I've learned. Oh, it looks like somebody wanted to add to it.
Thanks, Kevin. I was just saying, sorry, that was my comment. I'm an insurance lawyer in Kansas City.
Oh, cool.
And I'm on the IRC board. So I was just throwing in what we tend to read every day over here. But I don't do stuff globally like you get to do, just for our businesses and generally in the Midwest.
Yeah, well, but it's interesting because in the United States, we probably have some of the more complex insurance laws, right? Because we've got 50 states and each territory has its own set of rules as well. So
Yes.
I found that Puerto Rico and Guam tend to be some of the more difficult places globally to do business because they have not only a US set of laws they have to comply with, but they also have their own island specific protectionism that they deal with. So kudos to you for doing that.
We have something in Guam right now that is complicated. They look to California law and a bunch of stuff, but they're supposed to be using their own as well. So it's interesting.
Right. I find a couple of other things I've learned over the years is islands are extremely unique in the way they apply their laws. They tend to be the most protectionist economies of all. We see this right now, right, with the UK, kind of going back to its island mentality. But I find that countries that have a land partner are typically, there's some sort of agreement that, yeah, we can have some flexibility in how you comply with this. We understand that people come from outside and bring things to us. But if you're an island country, Southeast Asia has a couple that are pretty tricky. The South Pacific is very tricky to deal with. I find that island-based economies are brutal for compliance perspective because there is a law, you will comply with it, and if you don't, you must go away. So they don't even, I don't find that incarceration is a real challenge for non-compliance, but fines, penalties, and immediate removal from the island. I've seen that happen a number of times on large construction projects that create tremendous delays. And then the one other piece that I think I've learned most of all is that whatever my hobby is, and I like to exercise and run. I also enjoy hiking. Inviting people locally to go and participate in that with you, whatever your hobby is, I find to just be a tremendous icebreaker. To at least, if they're not interested in doing it, to at least ask them where's a good place to go to do this. Do they have a friend that might be interested in it? It just adds that level of humanity. So some minor details. I'd like to open up for any questions though. Does anybody have any comments, questions, additional thoughts? What am I missing?
Kevin, I'll ask one. In terms of COVID-19, what are you seeing differences and how insurers are responding and how that's being handled globally than how it's being handled in the US. Because I think when this all started happening, we were hearing different things out of London, for example, and we were hearing from brokers that there were government officials making statements thinking that, business interruption, for example, should be more readily available, while the insurance industry was pushing back significantly here in the States. So I didn't know how that was being handled sort of across the globe.
Yeah, great question. I would say COVID-19, and I'm sure you guys are staying close to it because I know the IRC's hosted some events. When I talked to the folks in Seoul, Korea, they never shut down, right? There was no lockdown. And they had 200 deaths out of a city that has 30 million people in it. No lockdown, no deaths. So in a place like that, the insurance response, there really wasn't any. In China, for example, most of the insurance companies are backed by the federal government or by the people in China. So whenever there's a cataclysmic event of any sort, insurance is really just a mechanism of refunding people for some of their losses. We haven't seen any real response from the insurers. And we really look at a couple of different insurance issues that are arising. One is injury to workers. So the idea of somebody gets sick from COVID-19, how is the insurance company going to be responding? The United States is one of the few countries that still has a privatized system there. So work injury isn't just a responsibility of the state. So in the UK, for example, you just go to the health service and that's where you would go. There's not really an insurance solution there. Germany's the same way. Most of Northern Europe is. China still has their social protection program in place. So in the United States, certain states, California, for example, have said that if you get sick from COVID-19, and you have a job, then that was from work, period. So each state, as you know, has its own applicability for workers' compensation. What I would say is there's not been a great deal of clarity from any one country on the work injury piece because it's usually a medical situation and medical coverage is the responsibility of the state in most places. From a business interruption perspective, this is a type of insurance coverage that responds historically, if your business suffers property damage, so a hurricane, earthquake, fire, hail, you name it. If the property is destroyed or damaged and you're unable to continue operating at full capacity as a business, there's a type of insurance called business interruption that can pay those claims. Right now, the US market and the London market, along with all the global markets, are holding the position that the presence of a virus does not constitute property damage. And most of those policies have an exclusion for viruses in them. So they are kind of standing on decent ground. You're shaking your head no?
No, we've reviewed a lot in the last couple months. I would not say that most of them have it. I mean, I would say that a substantial chunk of them do, but it's maybe 60-40.
Okay. Yeah, I would say it's a very common exclusion on the policies. And there are some insurance companies that offer some bit of coverage for that. I know FM Global, for example, usually put on $1 million sublimit for basically contamination, business interruption. So there's definitely some response from some insurers. But the position that most of those insurance companies are holding right now is, listen, insurance isn't built to respond when we all suffer a loss, right? That's not the way that insurance is set up. Insurance is set up that when most everything is going well for everybody else, but there are specific cases where people suffer catastrophic losses or they have a tremendous financial loss from some event that's totally fortuitous, that's when the insurance company can go and make those parties whole again. So whether it's right or wrong, that's sort of the position they're taking right now. And some of the insurance companies are struggling because different legislatures are trying to enact laws to force them to do things. And they're considering it sort of an extra contractual item. So that's a challenge. I would say the employment practices liability pieces, the cyber insurance pieces, and the directors and officers liability insurance. Those are the ones that we're seeing probably prepare to respond to some of these more amorphous losses that are happening. For example, when companies decide to make furloughs how are they choosing who to furlough? And there could be some discrimination that comes out of that. There could be people that feel like they're being wrongfully let go. So that'll be an interesting place to play. And then from the directors and officers liability, this is an insurance product that responds to um, the owners of the company or the directors of the company and how they behave, and did they put people at risk through their operations. I would say globally, we're going to have some really interesting lawsuits come out of this for people that continued operating, folks that didn't take loans from government, et cetera. So we haven't really seen what the insurance companies are going to do yet, but their line right now is really, this is an act of God. This is outside of our control. This is almost forced on us by governments to shut down. So those aren't typically covered by insurance policies. We'll see. There were some other questions coming through regarding students and what's the best way to prepare for an international career. I would say get in a study abroad program as soon as possible, or just you need to get out there and do it if you're not going to pay to be a study abroad. I kind of went around the system a little bit, even though I was a University of Missouri Columbia student. I found the cost of doing a study abroad was cost prohibitive for me. So I just went and enrolled in a local university myself. And I think my semester, this was going back to like 1999 and 2000. I think my semester dues were a couple of $100. And if I'd have done it through the university, it would have been thousands. So sometimes there's opportunities just to go enroll directly in a university. I think language skills are really essential to making that happen, though, so that you can navigate it appropriately. There was a question that came through. Do you think the commitment for flying overseas so often will affect your family life? Well, now that I'm on my second marriage, I would say yes. My extensive travel did affect my family life quite a bit. And I won't get into the details of that, but I will say if you're gone a lot, that obviously creates challenges. And then my wife now, she's accustomed to it. I think she likes it when I'm gone for a little bit because she gets to rule the roost a little bit more, and she gets to do things her way. So there's a lot of flexibility there, right? That you learn over time, which is if you're going to be gone for a couple of weeks and then you show up, learn the culture of your home again before you start dictating how things go. So, those are, again, lessons learned. And then there was another one. I know that my family's probably ready for me to get back on the road again right now, but I'd be curious if anybody else has got any upcoming foreign trips, because my understanding of it right now, in my mind at least, from what I've read, is no matter where I travel, if I cross an ocean to get there, I'm probably going to be quarantined for 2 weeks in a hotel before I can go make any meetings. That's if I even am permitted to enter by customs, right? And then on my return trip back to the US stateside, I'll also have a 2-week quarantine. So I'm accustomed to doing, I'll do a trip to Australia and spend 2 days there and then flip back right around. The days of that happening are gone, I think, for at least the foreseeable future. Another question. Transitioning to business community from teaching. Yeah, that was challenging. What I thought a good role for teaching was in my life was I was basically coming off of the road. I had hair down to my, hips. I looked pretty rough, and teaching was a challenge for me because I just needed to get more professional. But it also challenged me to, be comfortable speaking in front of people, directing a group of people to achieve goals and to hold people accountable for their own activities. And I don't think that business is too much different than that, other than you don't have the built-in trust of, okay, that's the teacher. I automatically know that that's somebody, I might not like them or not, but the teacher's role is usually understood by everyone in the class, whether they adhere to it or not. In the business community, I think it's the biggest learning curve was having to establish that, yes, I do belong here. I have something valuable to share. And how do I maintain some sort of captive audience, even if they don't have to be there? So that was the biggest difference, right? Is your audience has a lot more free will than they do in a school. Let's see, are there any more questions? I'd be curious about anybody else who travels overseas regularly, how that's affected your family life, because for me, it clearly had a real impact. It's not a direct correlation, but that's a real challenge, is staying in touch with folks while you're overseas, especially on time zones. Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, so my job has me going overseas pretty frequently, and I go to Asia quite a bit. And so I'm the last 2 months, obviously, all that stopped. But for us, we've got a 15-year-old daughter and my wife. And for us, we lived overseas together in Hong Kong. And my current job would have never worked with when our daughter was younger. And I don't think my current job would have ever worked had we not had the shared family experience kind of in Hong Kong together. And going into this job, it was very much a family decision as much as it was kind of my decision, with some uncertainty at the very beginning of, okay, let's give this 6 months, and then let's give it a year, and let's kind of recheck to make sure it's working right, because we certainly went into it knowing that there's some really big things that we want to solve. And at the end of the day, I don't want to, I'd rather fail on the job than fail on the family side. And so kind of went into the job knowing that, and we've been able to kind of, make it work, but it takes kind of focus and dedication, and making sure that time together is spent more valuably or deliberately than maybe just our casual time was before. So it's certainly a challenge, but it's something you have to invest in to make sure that it doesn't sneak up on you, and all of a sudden you realize it's not working. So anyway, that's kind of our story. It's not easy, but it's been okay.
How do you communicate when you're over in Asia for a lengthy period of time?
WhatsApp.
How do you stay in touch?
So we use WhatsApp all the time. Sometimes audio calls, sometimes video calls, but WhatsApp is what we wherever I am, whether it's Vietnam or Hong Kong, we use WhatsApp.
Got it. Well, thanks for sharing, Dave.
Yeah, you bet.
Anybody else have any ideas about best ways to stay in touch with the family or stay in communication with the homeland while you're away? All right. Well, some of the let's see, deglobalization. We keep seeing references to deglobalization. Perhaps this is being accelerated by the pandemic crisis. What's your perspective or experience? I think that's a nice thought, that we'll get more, all the manufacturing will be centered on each country. I just don't think it's possible. There's no way. I was talking to a gentleman who runs a logistics company locally here, and I'm getting ready to host a series of webinars on how we help manufacturing firms, especially in the Midwest, stay active and stay liquid right now in this challenging time. And we're talking about supply chain a little bit. And my question to him was the same. I said, do you think this is going to shift more activity back to the US? And he's like, no. He said he had a great story, and I think it was really telling. It was a US based company decided they made lighting for commercial and residential purposes. And they wanted to take full control of the lighting production because they were currently tied up with some supply chain bottlenecks at the time. This is going back about 6 or 7 years ago. And they had a huge order for lamps. They were unable to create a lamp weight, like the thing that just holds the weight to the table, like the dumbest part of the lamp. It was impossible to source that in the United States. The cost to do it was going to be greater than the rest of the lamp themselves, because they'd have to source the material here. They'd have to create an entirely new manufacturing process. You can't hire people to do it. It had to be done through robotics. Whereas you could get it for almost nothing out of several Southeast Asian countries, and there are people that make lamp weights. So the cost efficiencies behind trying to do something all within a given jurisdiction, I don't think it's possible. I think that ship has sailed, and I'm not even sure it ever really existed to begin with in an advanced economy. I would say that people are probably going to be a little more mindful about where they source their materials. So while I don't anticipate there's going to be any sort of deglobalization, I think people will be more interested in having a land-based supply chain opportunity if possible. Asia is clearly not going away from the manufacturing or even the technology space, but I think Mexico may see a slight pickup through this process. I think one interesting thing that's come out of this is people aren't talking about tariffs as much right now. I think people are willing to bear the pain of Chinese tariffs because China is operating right now and supplies and materials are coming out of China. Whereas I think Vietnam, Malaysia, Myanmar, Cambodia, they're still kind of opening up right now. Whereas China seems to be a little bit more, not full operational, but pretty darn close. So I think we may see a shift back towards China as those relationships maybe re-solidify. I also think it's interesting, a while back there was this real push away from China into some of the Southeast Asian countries in order to avoid those tariffs and for whatever political reason. But one interesting thing that I think came from that was you've got 1.5 billion people, my numbers are probably wrong here, but there's 1.5 billion people in China. There's just if you've been there and just you fly over the ports, I mean, they're massive, right? The infrastructure there is just incredible. And then if you're shifting that supply chain into Southeast Asia, you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the number of people, and the port capacity isn't what it is in China. So we can't all shift the supply chain out of China. It's not possible in order to and still maintain a healthy economy. I think there will be some shifts away from China. Not much though. I don't really anticipate that. Let's see. I don't have any. What's something, if you're going to take on a global role, what do you commit to? I think Dave made a good comment about being all in with the family. I used to make the mistake of getting excited about my foreign trips and I'd jump on them right away because there was no real consistency. It wasn't as if I spent every 2 weeks in a given place. I was meant to go and make sure I'm in touch with my clients wherever in the world they may be. And I'm oftentimes too quick to say, sure, I'll be there. And making sure that I check with my family before I go, I'd say, be mindful of family time and business time, and that there's a nice balancing act that comes with that. And then taking full advantage of the time I'm with my family. I don't watch TV. I don't do anything by myself really when I'm with the family because this is special time. And even if my time is limited, I maximize my use of the time. But Dave, I'd defer to you. It sounds like you're gone for longer stretches than me.
Yeah, it's I just echo what you said. What I said before is it's for an international assignment, whether you're moving overseas, or you're traveling a lot overseas. It's about you. It's about the company or the opportunity, and it's about the family. If you've got a family, and sometimes like one of those three things or two of those three things line up, but they all three, kind of have to line up to make it successful. So, we see a lot of people that, are interested, but there's not an opportunity, or there's an opportunity, but it's just the wrong timing for them or for their family. And so, all those things have to line up together for it to be successful. And so one of the reasons that like a lot of foreign assignments fail for expats, it's around the trailing spouse not adjusting. When you go to a foreign job, especially if it's a corporate job, there might be a whole organization that's kind of set up to help you adjust, and you're working on really meaningful work. You've got just really exciting stuff that all of a sudden you're working on. But the spouse that's, if you've got a family that's transitioning to, they don't have, people there that are kind of showing them the way or making things easy. And it can be really tough. And so it's really, if you're married, if you've got a family, the family's got to be kind of part of the equation, as part of it, because, if otherwise, won't be successful, or it's a lot harder for it to be successful.
Agreed. Evan, it looks like there's one more question. I'm happy to take it before we run out of time.
Yeah, absolutely. We got about 5 minutes. So anything anybody else has to ask Kevin before we're done, go for it.
There was one that was based on the Belt and Road Initiative that China has, and how will that affect production. Um, I think that's really just China's outreach to the world to try to create a network so that they have not only some political influence globally, but also access to markets. They have almost monopolized a few of the markets in the world, and this is a way for them to, I think, retain access to raw materials, developing markets. I think it makes perfect sense for them to do that. I do find that it's challenging for some of our partners, especially in South America, who are tempted to join this Belt and Road Initiative. And, the Chinese do business differently. They're not constrained by some of the things that our government requires of us. I mentioned earlier on the sanctions, where the U.S. government, we're not supposed to do business with people that are involved in nuclear proliferation. We're not supposed to do business with people that have child labor practices or that are involved in human trafficking. So there's lists, thousands of people that the United States companies can't do business with, and companies as well. There's also the UK Bribery Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The EU has its own set of sanctions against individuals, and then reverse sanctions, like we sanction Cuba, but in Europe you can't sanction Cuba, so it's illegal to sanction Cuba. So there's these variety of sanctions that the European and US economies, we've kind of handcuffed our businesses a little bit, not in a bad way. These are good, I think, moral imperatives. The Chinese aren't stuck having to comply with those things. So they can go in and offer an airport to a sub-Saharan country or a South American country, and who's going to turn that down, right? But it also means they're kind of going to infiltrate your economy a bit, and they want to be first in line for raw materials, and they want to be first in line with their market access. So I think there's a lot of challenging political conversations probably going around the world about this. There's some questions about study abroad programs going on and some internships. I can do a little plug for Lockton Companies right now. We have a very robust internship program where we have several hundred folks a year come into our Kansas City office, which is the headquarters, but there's 50 offices around the US, and then there's 50 non-US offices. And every time I go anywhere, I see a load of interns, and they're all paid internships. And if you ever want to have access to opportunity to be involved with multinational business, Lockton Companies is a great place to at least dip your toe in it. And you can also find a variety of other careers that don't touch the multinational space. But I think a little bit of globalization is good. It goes a long way in business.
Well, thank you again for joining us for today's event. Kevin, we want to thank you so much for donating your time and providing some really interesting information about your career and your history. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and continuing your support of the IRC. If you enjoyed today's event, we encourage you to consider joining us as a member or making a donation to the IRC. Thank you, guys. Please stay well. Kevin, do you have any final thoughts to share with the group?
Nope, feel free. If you want my contact information, reach out to me at any time. But I enjoyed it. Thanks for the conversation, everybody. Enjoy this weird time.
Thank you. Stay well, everyone.
Thank you.